Okay, are we live?
Said yes, we are live.
Okay, great. Always fun to be here. So, hey everyone, my name is Seth Shapiro. Some of you, if you've attended past sessions through GMAT Club, might recognize me. Done a few of these in the past. I am a senior consultant with Admissionato. We are an MBA and college consulting firm based in the US, but with people all over the world. And I'm happy to be presenting to you today all about letters of recommendation strategy for MBA applications. So just to give people a little bit of an overview, I'm going to go through a handful of slides, not too detailed, but enough to kind of get to whet your appetite. And then we'll have some time for a Q&A. So if you are interested in a question specifically about letters of recommendation, either the content I've presented or something else that's on your mind related to letters of recommendation, feel free to chat them in the chat box or the chat discussion we have here, and we'll take them in the order in which they come in. And then after that, we're actually going to have a separate session entirely on Zoom where I will be answering any spillover questions, doing profile evaluations, and just answering questions more broadly about the MBA application process, especially given that we are right in the midst of round 2. So as long as that works for everyone, let's get started. So you can see my screen, right? Is that perfect? Okay, great. So as I mentioned, I'm representing Admissionato. We are a premier admissions consulting and counseling and consulting firm. Our website is simply admissionato.com. We lay out all of our various services, profiles of our consultants, and most importantly, provide a link to our free consultation. So if you are interested in signing up for our services or have any sorts of questions, that is the best place to go. Okay, so getting into this session. Oh wait, hold on. Just want to see why we are not. Okay, great. I'm here now. All right. Excuse me. So, okay, I'm just testing this out. Great. So as I mentioned, this session is all about selecting and preparing the best recommenders. So, this is an important part of the process. We'll get into it in more detail, but it's something that people do need to spend a lot of time thinking about. It's kind of one of those X factors, almost along the lines of the essays that you write, because it's another person's opinion about you. Mostly in a professional setting, though there are examples where you can pull on someone for a personal reference. But this is another opportunity for the admissions committee at these business schools to get an understanding of who you are and what is your potential. Okay, great. So I'm just going to throw everything out there. This is my style. I like everyone to see all the material and absorb it. So there's always a question whether it's my clients or others that say, well, what am I supposed to be doing about letters of recommendation? This is the one thing that sort of is out of my hands, so to speak. And so there's a lot of different issues that come up. The first point is, someone might ask, or we hear this often, I'm worried about anyone in my workplace finding out that I'm applying to business school, especially my manager and supervisor. This is a very, very legitimate concern. Not every company, in fact, probably most companies, are not always entirely supportive of the idea of someone leaving their company to get a professional degree because they may not come back. There are many reasons, as I'm sure several of you who are watching today are feeling, as to why you are getting an MBA. It might be because you want to advance your skills, you want to build a network, you want to learn more business-related content. I get that. But a lot of you are also looking possibly to change professions, move companies, possibly even go to competitors from the company you're working at. And so it can be very uncomfortable for someone to inform people they work with or to whom they report that they're thinking about leaving. there's just an uncertainty. As a manager myself, I know that if someone expressed an interest in leaving, that concerns me because now I have to start thinking about their replacement. There are companies that do support people getting MBAs in general because that's their culture and they're supportive of their soon-to-be former employers, but or soon-to-be former employees. But there are also several companies that are interested in sponsoring their employees and who may eventually come back. A lot of people know that the investment banking firms or the consulting firms are very big on sponsorship. The idea being they pay for you and support you to get your MBA. You spend 2 years and then you eventually come back and work for them for a fixed number of years. That is, again, rarely the case. And so my best advice for this sort of situation is to try and get a finger on the pulse as far as, what is your company's viewpoint on this? Have there been other people who have left? To get an MBA or another degree? Were they supportive of that? In general, my best advice is if you can figure that out, great. But if not, keep it to yourself. You're best holding your cards close to the chest to avoid that sort of level of risk. Okay, a second point that we often hear about is I haven't worked for my current employer for very long, and I don't know if my current boss can write a very detailed letter of recommendation for me. That is another fair point. Some people just happen to switch jobs, in some cases months or even weeks before they decide they're going to apply to business school. If that's the case, you really don't want to ask your current boss or supervisor for a letter of recommendation. They're not going to have a huge sample size of information. And part of, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but part of what one of the questions that the recommenders are asked is, how long have you known this person? So if they say, well, I've only known this person for a few months, that letter of recommendation is probably not going to carry that much weight. So it is something that you have to take into account as far as longevity is concerned. But if that is the case where a current employer is someone who's relatively recent, you can absolutely go back to a previous employer or other people, even at your current company, who have known you for longer. As I will get into in more detail, the two most important criteria are: does this person know you, and do you trust this person? Right? Those kind of tackle both of these first 2 points. So just keep that in mind. A third point, and a very, very frequent question that we get, is how important is it to have a letter of recommendation for an alumnus of the school I'm applying to? The short answer is it is not important at all. It can be helpful, but it's not going to be the difference maker between whether you get in or whether you don't get in. There is a little bit of a nuance there for two reasons. In two cases. One is, if the person who's writing your recommendation happens to be an alumnus of the school to which you are applying, they may know how to phrase their letter in a way that bridges the gap or forms a connection between your personality, your strengths, and those that the school are looking for, right? Graduates of these schools know the general cultures of these schools, and so they can kind of make that connection and almost put it out there for the AdCom to say, yes, this is true, or yes, we don't, or no, we don't believe this. The second example, and this is rarely the case, or less often the case, is if the alumnus of the school to which you're applying happens to be very influential. They are very involved as an alumnus. They're very well known, or other such examples. And so I would say, yes, that might be helpful because the admissions committee will recognize this person is vouching for someone to attend their alma mater. Again, that doesn't oftentimes be the case, but sometimes it does pop up. A fourth question we get is, can I submit extra letters of recommendation? The answer is really no, unless the school says, the schools are very particular when it comes to their applications in general about what is a requirement and what is not a requirement. Sometimes there will be some optional wiggle room, such as you've seen, probably optional essays. If it is an option that is granted to you, by all means take it. But for the most part, if the school asks for a fixed number of recommendation letters and does not allow you to offer an optional one, do not submit one. They won't reject you on that basis, but they definitely will not read it. It's only fair to every candidate if they're following the rules. So those are a few little of the questions that we've come across, but again, there will be more, and we'll get into it shortly. Okay, so this is all about what really goes into the letter of recommendation. Or what really the purpose is for that matter. So letters of recommendation will, as the note says here, provide a validation of your story. In other words, where you're coming from in your career, what you've accomplished, what you've exhibited on your resume, and potentially also, to the extent you've shared with this recommender, what you're planning to get out of business school and where you're planning to go after that. And the second insights that they provide are just about your potential in general. This is kind of more of the soft side, but James is a great leader. Wendy is a real team builder, and so forth. Right? This is always helpful, as I mentioned earlier, for a recommender to be sort of a third-party perspective on who you are and how you've interacted in the workplace or elsewhere. And at their best, letters of recommendation add third-party voices that should seal the deal for you with the outcome. Again, you're not going to likely get in because of a recommendation letter. It's very rarely the case that someone picks a recommender who's going to nail it truly out of the park. Everyone is obviously picking people who they trust and who they know and who will say great things about them. So it's hard at a certain point to kind of differentiate it, but it can be the nice sort of thing where maybe you're a borderline candidate and you get this great recommendation letter from someone who says, hey, this really touched us, or the recommender introduced an anecdote or some sort of evidence of your character or your accomplishment that really did in the end kind of tip the balance in your favor. And then as far as the actual recommendation letters as they're referred to are concerned, for the most part, they kind of touch upon or capture three different components. The first one is biographical information. That's actually about the recommender themselves. So, what is your title? How long have you been at the company? How do you know the candidate applying? And things like that, just more to kind of contextualize where they're coming from, so the recommender so the admissions committee actually has some information to wrap their head around. The second is going to be what's called a ranking matrix, and this is going to kind of look like basically one category going down, or one axis going down, which has various characteristics or attributes about you. So it might be things such as leadership, consensus building, technical aptitude, creativity, and so forth. You get the idea. And then on the other category, or the other side of the matrix, you're going to see sort of the relative ranking. So it might be, scale of say 1 to 5, with 1 being does not really demonstrate at all to 5 strongly demonstrates, and then the middle being somewhat neither demonstrates nor doesn't demonstrate, or something to that effect. Every school is a little bit different, but the idea there is that you should really try and push your recommenders to rank you not only obviously in where they truly believe you fit, but to obviously push it towards the higher end of the scale, but especially for the particular schools you're applying to. So for example, if you want to touch upon your relative strength, so if you're applying to technical finance, say schools like Wharton, Columbia, Booth, or others, you might be best served by pushing your recommenders to the extent they're comfortable with ranking your technical aptitude high, because if they rank it, say, low, or don't really give you a full throttle endorsement, the school might sort of wonder, well, will this person be able to handle the unique nature or the bent to our curriculum? So that's just something to keep in mind. And then the big part that most people tend to, or big component that most people tend to think about, is the free response section. This is sort of the classic letter, if you will. A lot of the top schools actually have very, very specific questions that they want you to ask. It's not just an open-ended letter, although I think MIT Sloan does that. So the free response is going to maybe be, the first question could be, well, how do you know this candidate, and how does this candidate stack up relative to his or her peers? And so you'll need to actually make sure that your recommender answers this question with a relative ranking in place. And then the other question that's very popular is talk about a time in which you provided constructive criticism to the candidate. How did he or she react to that, and so forth. Again, these questions do change year over year. The other thing, too, by the way, to keep in mind is there is something called, I believe it's the common letter of recommendation. A lot of schools, especially top ones in the U.S., use this where you're writing one, call it generic letter, or one set of questions that then can be sent out to a bunch of schools. It's actually very nice because, as we'll get into at some later point in this session, this is a huge ask of your recommenders. And so this is just one avenue that the schools have come together to say, hey, we can cut down on the work for all parties involved and make this a little bit easier for everyone. Okay. So, obviously the natural question will be, well, what makes a really good, or as we put it, stellar letter of recommendation? And the first bullet point, detail, 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 is obviously the name of the game. When you want your recommender to really show that he or she knows you quite well, right? You had a good working relationship. You've been on projects or responsibilities together. And so all of that needs to come through. And it needs to be specific. It needs to be backed up with evidence and anecdotes. So if a recommender is going to say, on one hand, Sally is a really nice person to work with. She's very friendly and everyone around the office likes her. Okay, that's great. But like, what did that really tell us? Versus the alternative would be, well, John is a phenomenally numbers driven person who always seeks to get the most proficient and accurate answer from his clients and colleagues alike. When I work with him on the marketing project for X company, he showed his ability to look at customer by customer analyses in a very delicate and thorough way, and so forth. And so you get the idea, right? The second example is really showing that the recommender not only knows the candidate, but is able to back up their claims with evidence. And the second bullet point here, going back to the slide, a recommender who knows you well and speaks to your business abilities is pretty much par for the course, or following from that. You want someone who can demonstrate that you have formed a good relationship with them and that they understand you for the professional you are and the professional you aspire to become. We have something at Admission Auto, and this is the third bullet point, called sort of the 70-30 rule. And what we mean by that is 70% of the recommendation letter should be capturing things that you as the candidate are aware of. So, accomplishments you've had, your skills, your strengths, and so forth. And then the 30% is kind of the information that the candidate might actually not be aware of, but it's kind of captured behind the scenes. So this might be, for example, if you were in a consulting firm and you were ranked at the high end of your class, and this recommender sat in those evaluation meetings and said, we as a collective, the firm really found that he had this truly unique ability to bring people together, or relative to his peers, he stood out for his leadership and his integrity, or things like that. That's the kind of information that we hope really good recommenders are able to bring to the table that can kind of help separate you, even if it's only just a little bit. And then the fourth point, honesty and authenticity, speaks for itself. These letters really should come through as very genuine endorsements of your personality and professionalism. So most schools will ask for a letter of recommendation from your boss. They might use other sorts of terms such as supervisor or manager. They're all pretty much synonymous with one another. It doesn't really matter. And the reason being is because this is a person to whom you're reporting, who is evaluating you, who is likely giving you responsibilities and project work. And so they're able to kind of see what it is that you're capable of, and how you've likely progressed over the duration of your time working for the company and for them in particular. But obviously, as we talked about earlier, what if you're in a position where you really can't get a letter of recommendation from your current boss? Is that sort of the end of the line here? The answer is absolutely not. For the reasons we discussed earlier, you may not be in a position to ask your boss because you could jeopardize your job, or you don't want to even take that risk for that matter. That's fine. There are plenty of alternatives here, right? So you can talk about a former boss, right? Maybe that's someone at the company who you trust, again, who is no longer supervising you. It could be a former boss at your previous company. Say you've switched jobs since college. That might be a very viable option. Again, it talks here about supervisor of some other form, maybe someone who you don't necessarily report to, but is kind of like a mentor, or really anyone else for that matter who has had some sort of exposure to you, and hopefully is senior in some capacity or another. The idea is, and we'll get into this, you don't really necessarily want a peer or even someone reporting to you to write it. That just doesn't seem like it carries much weight. But the point is again, if you can't ask your boss or your manager, don't fret. Like, this oftentimes is the case, and there are many, many viable alternatives. The admissions committees understand that that's not the case for everyone, As far as how you address it, you can either just submit the recommendation letters with these people for who they are, or you can always lightly mention them in your optional essays, assuming you're not using that for something else. Okay, and so yes, the recommendation letter is not going to be your work product. You are obviously responsible for writing the essays, putting together the application, and frankly, everything else that went into it in terms of your accomplishments. But there is a lot that you can still do with your letters of recommendation to get them off the ground. So the first thing is start early. And what we mean by start is identify who these people are that you're going to ask for your recommendation letters. It's fine to ask them months in advance. I mean, I don't think you need to do it a year out. That might be a little too far, and who knows where the circumstances change. But, I always recommend to people as soon as like the applications come out, if you're looking at round one, you can start asking around that time, maybe in the late spring, early summer. If you're still contemplating applying and you're not sure, you obviously don't want to just get people in line if you're not going to take advantage of this ask. So whenever you feel it's an appropriate time, it is always advisable to just let your recommenders know, or sort of, again, secure them and let them know that this is something you'd like them to do. We talk in the second bullet about making it easy for your recommenders by laying out all the information for them. This is really helpful. I think this is not only an efficient and extremely tactical approach to making a good recommendation, but it's also just a nice courtesy. So what I mean by this is you might want to put together like a briefing packet or a one-pager with information that if you were writing a recommendation, you want to know. So for example, which schools are you applying to? What are the deadlines? You might want to capture what you think are your strengths and how you've worked to exhibit those. Maybe you also talk about areas that you feel you've improved on, whether that's something that takes the form of a self-evaluation or something you've actually discussed with this recommender in the past. You might also want to talk about projects you've worked on with them, presumably, or maybe projects that they've seen you work on, even if it wasn't directly for them. The idea being is give them as much information as possible up front, because it just will be nice to jog their memory. And even if the recommenders don't necessarily use that information, and you'd be surprised, that often can be the case, it's at least a nice way for you to kind of get their mind thinking about who you are and what you've been able to accomplish. The third point is a really, really critical one, in that it's your job to stay on top of these deadlines. View this almost as like a management exercise, right? You're applying for an MBA program, you aspire to be a manager. This is an excellent way to show that you can do this right, even if the admissions committee doesn't obviously have to see how you managed it. So what I mean by that is, if you start really early, check in maybe once a month just to see if there's any updates, assuming you gave them your recommenders the task of actually putting together a work product, or just check in and say, hey, I just want to make sure you're still on board. We're game for this and so forth. And certainly as you get closer to the deadlines and recommendation letters have not been submitted, it's always good to kind of just say, listen, is there any information I can provide? Are you comfortable with it and so forth? Because don't forget, your recommenders are doing this outside of their normal work. And so it's a big ask, especially if you're applying to multiple schools, and sometimes other things come up. So while you'd like your recommenders to get this stuff done early, in many cases they don't, which is fine. It's not going to penalize you, but you just want to make sure that they're on top of it, because this is your future. The fourth bullet point talks about requesting to see a draft. This is not always going to be the case for everyone. In some cases, recommenders will prefer the privacy. They want to be able to write what they want to write, and so they won't necessarily share that with you. In other cases, recommenders are very happy to send drafts to you to say, hey, here's what I'm writing. Is this accurate? Is there anything you'd like me to add, and so forth? It really is a very much a case-by-case situation. At Admission Auto, we love it when recommenders will send drafts, because we'll actually help review them. And in often cases, that can be helpful for a few different reasons. One being that we get to see if the story that the recommenders are telling is consistent with what you're sharing in your essays, or it's also helpful in avoiding any sort of contradictions. And then if we're seeing recommendation letters from multiple recommenders, we're able to make sure that there isn't necessarily duplication of content between the 2 or 3 recommenders, and that collectively they're bringing in as much diverse viewpoints and experiences as possible. So again, it's not always something that people have the liberty of taking advantage of, but it is something if your recommender offers, you should consider taking advantage of. And then fifth is obviously be gracious, say thank you. You don't have to get a gift. Some people do if they feel that's appropriate, but it is again a huge ask for these people, and they're supporting you in your career and your progress. And so you'd be surprised how far a thank you goes. Okay, and a few don'ts just to keep in mind here. And again, we've seen them all, so I'm gonna really drive these points home. Don't write your own letters of recommendation, letters of recommendation for your recommender to sign. This is huge. You'd be surprised how hugely obvious this is. One, because the styles end up sounding similar to your essays, and two, it's actually very easy to tell when someone has written their own recommendation letter. The information that's brought to bear, it just doesn't come off the same way. And so your recommender might say, just send me a draft, and then they say, I'm happy to endorse it. Really try and push them to write their own letter. You can, again, outline things for them, provide these briefing packets that help cut down on the amount of work, but at the end of the day, we really do want it to come from them. It will make a huge difference. As I mentioned earlier, don't ask a peer or a subordinate to write you a letter of recommendation. These are not going to carry any weights. This is clearly, in the case of the subordinate, a conflict of interest, and a peer may not be someone who's trustworthy, may not have quite the same sort of evaluative approach. It's just not advisable. And as I talked about in the third point, no extra letters of recommendation especially if the schools tell you cannot. The only area where you might want to be able to send, or you can send, an extra letter of recommendation is if you find yourself on a wait list. That in some cases can be really helpful. And so if you're deciding, say, between 3 recommenders for 2 slots, you might want to keep the third one sort of on the back burner in the event that you find yourself on a wait list that need that sort of extra information. And this last point is an interesting one as well, which is to avoid using different recommenders for different schools. I realize the temptation not to ask someone, if you're applying to over 5 schools, to say, hey, I need all these letters. And so it's a good way to kind of diversify things. It just ends up creating a lot more work for you. And it might create complications with the story, especially if there's a balance between how you're thinking about recommenders. I mean, it's not absolutely a no, but it is definitely something we kind of advise against. The good thing with these recommendation letters, as I mentioned, is that oftentimes the questions are the same. The word counts might be slightly different. So it's just something to keep in mind, that theoretically the work gets easier, and there's more repetition as economies of scale kick in. So that's it. As far as this presentation is concerned, I am excited to take your questions. I've not been looking at the screen. So I am going to tune back into I guess we don't have time for Q&A. Okay, so yes, I guess I did close out. Okay, so no time for Q&A, but there is going to be a Zoom Q&A session, as I mentioned earlier, in which case please join us following this session, and I am happy to take questions from this session in that one, or really any other questions you have. So thank you for your time, and again, admissionauto.com if you want to reach out and talk to us about anything else, especially for those who are applying for round 2 and round 3 of this year.